Guys, welcome back to my video series, Agile Development 101. Last video, we finished the sprint review and the sprint retrospective, which means there is no gap in between sprints. So that's a free answer to a PSM1 question. The next sprint begins immediately, and it begins with sprint planning. I think it's worth making a video of this one because the next item on our backlog is kind of special in a way because it is a Nfr Non Functional Requirement. Basically, there's some sort of code refactoring that needs to happen to enable the cargo component to work on both the shipment and the quotation. And I would say there's probably same thing needs to happen on the movement as well. So NFRs, right, non-functional requirements, are typically only fully understood by the development team and maybe not fully understood by the product owner because product owner is usually not so technical. So how do you prioritize something like this when you don't understand it? The answer is that you need to have a conversation, you being the product owner. Product owner has to have a conversation with the development team proactively to identify NFRs and the potential impact of doing them versus not doing them. So the way this conversation might go is that development team has offered up that they believe that this thing needs to happen, and the product owner should say, well, why does that need to happen? And they said, well, the cargo component is probably the most complex part of the system right now. And if it doesn't work if we can't reuse this code between the two modules, then we're going to have to write it again for the shipment, which means it's going to take a lot of time. It took us a long time to make it the first time around. It'll take us a long time to make it the second time around. And if they diverge in functionality, then we're going to have to maintain two different components. So every time there's a change request, like the way in which the package type works, we would have to make it in two places instead of one place, and we just double our maintenance costs for anything cargo related. So if we don't do it now, then we run the risk of having to fix it later, which is going to take 10 times as much time. So that's good feedback. And then the product owner should say, well, do we have to do it right now if we don't make the cargo section in the shipment itself? Is there anything we can do before this without having our two versions of the cargo component diverge? And then the development team could say, yeah, well, we could build the link and the stub for the shipment editor. So we could say build link to shipment editor and stub, because looks like my connection's not working. Right. Because if there's a stub, it means that the cargo component's not in there. So we could do that part. The other thing that we could do is potentially set up the data structure for the, or parts of the data structure for the shipment. And we could also do some UI around turning a quote into a shipment, create new shipment, delete shipment, archive shipment, save shipment, that type of stuff we could do without having any kind of editor, which means we could do it before this this cargo component work. And so then it's up to the product owner. So he has more information. He knows there's some stuff we could do beforehand. What's more important? to do this stuff beforehand or to do this this part? And to answer that question, you probably would also like to know how long it's going to take, like how much effort is it to do each of them. And so the development team would say, well, don't know exactly. This cargo component isomorphic thing is not something that we've done before, but this link and stuff we have done before. We're very confident about that. And I would say, we could, it would only take a couple of hours to do. So that's my own personal estimate for this. Whereas this one probably requires a bit of investigation before we would know for sure. And so this whole discussion is happening in the sprint planning meeting, and so what I would do in that meeting is I'd say, okay, let's take both of the items into the sprint, like tentatively, and in the second half of the sprint planning meeting. So there's two parts. One is where we select the items for the sprint, and the second part is where we plan out the development of those items. So in the second half of this meeting, let's do some tech analysis of this item and find out if it's really doable in one sprint or not, based on what we found in the code and based on the sort of changes we need to make. So then what the development team should do, if my internet was working, we would do it. We would drag these cards into here. So let's pretend we've done that. And then we would start looking at the code, the cargo code, to see how much effort is it going to be to make it what do you call it, isomorphic. Okay, so now I'm going to go look at the code. This is going to be a little bit technical, but there is a file called cargo reducers. Okay, and this is in the UI. Well, it's sort of the UI. This is how the actions of the user get processed, the logic of them. And so this thing is in a tree structure, which is embedded in the quote structure, which means it's not in the, there is no shipment structure for this, so that it's not in the shipment structure. So how does this quote structure look? Quote reducer. Well, it's taking cargo and then sticking it in the quote reducer structure. So now, as a development team member, I'm thinking maybe this is also already kind of isomorphic because this is in an independent file. And if I built, like this quote, if I built a shipment reducer, I could just import this cargo into it, assuming it works the same way and has the same logic. If they have two differing logics, then it's going to be tough, and I would have to tell the cargo it is part of a quote or part of a shipment, and then have the logic behave differently for each. Ideally, they will have the same logic, but that's a bit of a business requirement. The other thing I should check is that cargo doesn't have dependencies on other quote structures. So if I go up here, the only import is on a generic action type, which means there are no dependencies. And I'm only passing in the cargo state. So there's 0 dependencies for the cargo, which means, yeah, so it means that at least for the logic part of how actions get processed, there is no, it's already isomorphic. So that reduces the workload a lot from what I initially thought. The other part of this is the UI. And right now the UI for this, if I look here, it's split between containerized and loose, and there's 2 different interfaces. Is that going to work? I'm not sure, because if we're sending full container loads, then we probably also need to have some what's inside it, which is sort of like the loose section. So that the display of this cargo section probably needs to be modal. Well, one of two things. Either we maintain it like this in the quote, but then in the shipment, we have the ability to display one after the other. So the packages and then the containers, or the containers and then the packages. Or what we do is we display both all the time on both the quote and the shipment. And so we might ask this question to the product owner, and the product owner might say something like, well, containers aren't used in air freight shipments, so it's probably not a good idea to have it displayed all the time. So what we're probably looking at is some kind of a modal feature that needs to be built into this cargo component. So building that feature is actually not so much logic, and gives me a much better idea of how much work needs to be done to be able to reuse everything I have here, or almost everything, with just a few tweaks to make it work for a shipment. The other thing is there's probably, so the product owner should mention, there's probably some more fields that need to be here for a shipment, like a description. And then the development team might say, well, that's not such a big deal, because as soon as it's modal, we can hide and remove fields as needed, and our reducer can stay with the same logic for each. The reducer logic only gets applied if the UI has some connection to it. So whether or not a description field appears on the screen will dictate whether or not description logic gets used. And the product owner might just nod his head and say, okay, whatever. But at the end of the discussion, what we found out, and what I found out genuinely from talking to myself, is that this work is much smaller than I thought, which means I think I can do both this item and this item in the same sprint. They're, I would say, somewhat similar in size. I might even be able to do more of this stuff, and I think I could probably do this record shipment cargo, because if they're very isomorphic, then there isn't a whole lot I have to do except maybe add the description field. So what I would do is I would take these 3 cards, and that would become my sprint. And so that's kind of a nice microcosm of the type of discussion you would want to have in sprint planning. The good part of the meeting that we just had was that we had some assumptions about the size of something, and we didn't just take those assumptions and use them. We questioned those assumptions and investigated and validated, and we came up with a better answer, which allowed us to effectively triple the amount of work that we can get done, the amount of output that we can get out of a sprint. So it was an effective discussion. It was useful and efficient, and helped our team be more productive overall. All right, so we've done our sprint planning. Yep, thanks for watching. I'm not sure what will be the next video, but hope to see you again next time.